I love the relaxed nature of the group, by the way. I should bring my dog in here. All these pet people, it's great. Uh, what I would like help from is ask me questions as I go along. So it'll help me know where you want to go with the conversation. Okay?
Great.
Uh, as David said, I've written 15 books on the subject of near-death experiences. And I think I might be done by now, but now I'm starting to think there's other subjects we can tackle. Before I talk about first dealing with Raymond Moody and then on, let me make just a general statement about all of my books. And that is that all of them reach the same conclusion, that the brain doesn't know what the mind contains, which means that we all have brains, we all have a mind, yet sometimes the mind seems to operate by its own set of rules, and it's within those rules that mystical experiences seem to occur. So in that regard, maybe the elements and lessons of an NDE are that all around us all the time, the elements and lessons are always around us, and we just aren't prepared to see them until we reach our endpoint. Maybe that's what happens. An endpoint takes place and a whole new world is revealed to us. It's like getting out of a taxi cab and into an airplane. Maybe it's just that simple. I don't know. Nobody knows. Also, nobody knows why an NDE takes place. Nobody can adequately explain consciousness, and nobody knows if all of our thoughts and perceptions come from our brains. Some people believe they come from outside our brains. Those are thoughts that are always on my mind and always on Raymond's mind and other researchers as well, is just what is consciousness and how do NDEs take place. So that said, I'll start at my beginning. 37 years ago now, I received a call from my book agent, Nat Sobel. And I was in New York City. I was editing a health magazine called American Health. And I got a call from Nat, and he said, "Hey, do you want to write a book with Raymond Moody?" And I said, "I don't know who Raymond Moody is." And he said, "Well, he's the guy who named and defined the near-death experience." And I said, "I really know very little about near-death experiences." And so Nat, the way most agents are, he said, "Well, you know what? Maybe you're not so smart. Maybe you're not smart enough to be the editor of a major health magazine if you don't know what a near-death experience is. So why don't you go visit with Raymond and talk to him about writing a book with him?" So I did, and he was not at all what I expected. We jokingly call him like he's like a Southern doctor. He has that Southern accent all the time. Gomer Pyle with an MD, that's what we call him. And he turned out to be wonderful. He didn't mind all my ignorant questions, which they certainly were, since I knew nothing about the subject. And we started researching together on this book, which was eventually published under the name The Light Beyond. And you all know the elements of a near-death experience. So we went through all that in the beginning. And when we finished the book, I started looking at the book and I realized that there were holes in it that hadn't been filled by anybody's research. We wrote this book in 1989, and there really wasn't a lot of research on near-death experiences at the time, not like there is now. And the one big gap in the book that I found was a lack of research on children and near-death experiences. There had been really very little done. Raymond had a couple of case studies, and there were a few other people who had them. And he said, this week I just spoke to a guy named Melvin Morse in Seattle, and he is a pediatrician there. And he wrote a short piece for JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, on a girl who had a near-death experience. She fell into a pool at the YMCA. And that has kind of launched him on a project of doing something on near-death experiences of children. The one thing about near-death experience books is they're all based on stories. And it's kind of like life itself. Our whole lives are based on stories. That life is a narrative. An awful lot of medical research is narrative as well, and that's how it is with near-death experiences. So I went to see Melvin and told him that I wanted to write a book about children and near-death experiences. And he thought that was an excellent idea. And he told me about the first case he ever witnessed. That was a woman named Crystal Merzlach. And Melvin was on his internship, and he was in Idaho. He was in Idaho. He lived in Seattle later. And he was in Idaho, and this girl was found floating face down in a YMCA pool. And she was pulled out of the pool. She was in a coma almost immediately. She wasn't breathing. They tried to resuscitate her, loaded her into the ambulance and took her to the hospital where Melvin was. And Melvin worked on her and brought her back. But people who are in a coma, particularly at an end stage coma, need to have all this equipment put in. They need a breathing machine to breathe for her. They need other things. She was failing all the tests for consciousness. She had no gag reflex. Her eyes wouldn't respond to light. So she was in a deep coma. And they got her breathing with resuscitation, but they figured she had about a 10% chance of living. And so Melvin told that to her parents, and her parents said, I don't think that's true. We're Mormon, and we look at this stuff differently. So there were 5 people in her family, plus her parents, and they all encircled her bed for 3 days. And they did a prayer circle for 3 days. Melvin and all the other doctors thought she was going to be gone, but one of the doctors came in and called her a first-class train wreck. But 3 days later, she came out, and everyone wondered why. Everyone wondered why she had drowned at the YMCA pool and how she was able to come out of this deep coma. So about 3 or 4 days later, Melvin asked her and her mother to come in so he could talk to her. And he said, he asked her, well, what happened? Just a very open-ended question. And he thought she would say, oh, I hit my head in the pool and I blacked out. But she said, you mean what happened when I saw the Heavenly Father? And Melvin says, yeah, that's good. I'll take that. What happened? And she told him this near-death experience she had had. She told him about seeing Jesus. This isn't a religious talk, by the way. I'm just telling you what she said. She told him about seeing Jesus. Uh, she told him about running into a girl named Elizabeth, who she called her guardian angel. And he took her to meet, she took Crystal to meet her deceased grandfather and 2 little boys named Andy and Mark, which she described as being souls waiting to be born. She was given, during her NDE, she was given a glimpse of her home. She was able to essentially, in an out-of-body state, go to her home, go in through the roof, and see her sister and her brother playing, and be able to tell later what toys they were playing with, what clothing they were wearing. And she also made a crayon drawing of Andy and Mark for Melvin. She saw her parents, totally accurate in what she said they were wearing. And all of this stuck in Melvin's head. And he followed his instincts and began researching children and near-death experiences. That was the genesis of his project. He became a collector of tales, like to the point where his practice was almost difficult to maintain his practice because he was seeing so many children and their parents who had had children who had had near-death experiences. And I mean, he had a lot. One of his second one was a child who blacked out in the ER because his heart kept stopping. And he had really a first-class near-death experience where he saw dead relatives and went up a tunnel and then saw a being of light. This being of light is very important overall, as you probably know. It's certainly important with children. He saw his third case was a boy with infections from a kidney transplant. He had sepsis. He had to have a heart valve surgery, and he awoke with a wonderful story to tell his mother. I should read that to you. Oh, I got to turn my light on. The little boy said, I remembered going to the hospital that day. My parents had gone into a room, the admitting office, when suddenly I heard a whooshing sound in my ears. It felt like I felt like you feel when you go over a bump in a car going really fast and you feel your stomach drop out. I heard a buzzing sound in my ears. And the next thing I knew, I was in a room, crouched in a corner of the ceiling. I could see my body below me. It was real dark, you know. I could see my body because it was lit up with a light, like there was a light bulb inside me. And his he kept having these case studies come in. Uh, Another one was, oh yeah, a boy who woke up and said to his mother, I have a wonderful story to tell you, mother. And he said, I woke up from surgery and there was my room, but there was my mom. I just couldn't tell, I just couldn't wait to tell her what happened while I was on the other side. I said, I have a wonderful secret to tell you, mother. I've been climbing a staircase to heaven. It was such a good and peaceful feeling. I felt wonderful. I was on a staircase and it was dark, and I started climbing upward. I got about halfway up the staircase and decided not to go any higher. I wanted to go on up, but I knew I wouldn't come back. If I went too high, that would hurt my mom and my dad, since my little brother had already died. There wouldn't have been anyone to take care of.
Oh, wow.
So he kept seeing these, he kept collecting these stories. And uh, we put them together in this book, Closer to the Light. I don't know if you've ever read this. This is, I don't say my books are fantastic very often, but this is a fantastic book. And what we did was we put them all together, of course, into a book. And we found all kinds of interesting things in studying children and then in studying the history of near-death experiences as well. We stumbled onto a thing called that we called conjured death. And what this was, I know this has nothing to do with children, really, but we found that the ancient Egyptians would suffocate royals in coffins if they survived, were interviewed for what they saw. So they would be in a coffin, they would essentially suffocate in these coffins. The big stone ones, if you've been to Egypt or if you ever seen any documentaries on it, you know what I'm talking about. And they would suffocate their royals because they wanted to know if the royals could go back and talk to their smarter elders and find out how to solve certain problems. The Mayans did a similar thing. They would take sea urchin needles and insert them into an artery that's right below the penis. And it would just, it's a big artery and they would bleed them. They would bleed their royals. This would be the top kings. They would bleed their royals to, once again, for them to go back and talk to previous kings and queens to see what they do about different issues they had going on and couldn't solve. Many of them died doing that, but that was their method of conjuring their own death and using it for ancestral wisdom. One of the most intriguing things about this book, Closer to the Light, was the level of transformation that children talked about. And what we decided to do was do a book called Transformed by the Light. That involved several doctors in Seattle, uh, several doctors and well, nurses as well. And we interviewed about 400 people who had some who had near-death experiences, some who hadn't. We had to deal with different grades of consciousness. And we found out some really fascinating things about the transformation that takes place with near-death experiences. One was children are deeply transformed by near-death experiences. They don't have much of a life review, as many people do, because they don't have much of a life to review. But it seems that the light that the children experience is much more extraordinary than the experience that adults have, that adults experience. We also found that not just children, but we looked at people from all ages and who had near-death experiences. So what we wanted to do was look at them and see how the near-death experience has changed them over the years. And we found that on the whole, everyone had a decrease in death anxiety. They had a higher zest for living, which means they were type A without the anger. They had higher intelligence. As Melvin put it, people who have NDEs evolve into higher beings. They had an increase in psychic abilities. On the average, people who have had near-death experiences, particularly the experience of light, have 4 times as many verifiable psychic experiences as those who haven't had a near-death experience. A verifiable experience would be precognition in a way. Let's say the real extreme one would be you get up in the morning, you're supposed to fly to somewhere, and you tell your partner, I'm not going to fly today because I had a dream last night that the plane crashed, and then the plane crashes. That would be a verifiable psychic experience. There's less extreme ones, of course. They're less afraid of death, as I already said. And a very interesting thing, too, is they have a greater appreciation of learning. It's interesting because it seems as though many of them think that they've had information downloaded into them during their near-death experiences. Has anyone here had a near-death experience? No? Well, that's with people who have near-death experiences, it's fairly common for them to go to a crystal city, and that's described by many people as a crystal city. It's not just a few. Many people who have this experience. They'll describe libraries in this crystal city, and many of them say that they know everything by the time they leave, come out of their NDE, but they forget it. They have a sense of all knowing, but they forget it. There are some people who don't forget it, and there are people around who go to one of these libraries, these crystal libraries, and they come back with knowledge that changes their life. I mean, I can think of one with a guy named Tony Sicorio. He's an orthopedic surgeon in Syracuse, New York. And he was struck by lightning in the top of his head out at a golf course. And golfing was over and he was getting a hot dog. And he was in a line, and behind him was an emergency room nurse. So she saved his life. He was out, and she resuscitated him, brought him back. And all of a sudden, he got this strong desire to play the piano. So, after surgery at night, he would go home and he would play the piano late. and study it and study it. He hired a coach from Juilliard to help him. And over the years, he's now become so good that he's played at Lincoln Center in New York, and he's also played at halls in Germany, concert halls in Germany. He's a very interesting guy. And that's the kind of thing that does happen to these people who think they've had information downloads. So after that book with Melvin, uh, we decided to do another book called Where God Lives. And it's a book that's largely based on the brain and looking at the work of a brain surgeon from Canada from years ago named Wilder Penfield. And Wilder Penfield was, he would use an electric pen, electric pencil. So when he had someone's cranium opened, he would touch different spots to see if he could find what different parts of the brain did. The brain hadn't been mapped yet. I'm not really sure it is now totally. But he would go into the right temporal lobe and he would find people who had many of the experiences, many of the features of a near-death experience. People would say that they had left their body when he would touch the right temporal lobe. Uh, they would had left their body. He said he'd touch the right temporal lobe and they would start talking because brain surgery is often done without total anesthesia.
Right.
And so these people would start telling that, gee, they'd say, I'm out of my body. I'm hovering above the operating room table. And he was kind of fascinating, but in the end, he he wrote a great book on mysteries of the mind. And his book said that nobody knows how the brain works. Nobody knows how consciousness works. And the mind won't tell the brain what consciousness is how he put it. Uh, he was one of the people who did believe in thoughts coming to us from outside. Eben Alexander believes that as well. There's a lot of other people who do. And part of that is they can't always figure out how thoughts generate and how consciousness generates. Uh, After that book, I was at a conference with Melvin and a conference with Melvin and Raymond. It was in Seattle. And a group of people came up to us after the conference and they said, uh, I really can't wait until I die. I want to have a near-death experience and I just can't wait until I die. And it was repeat. It was several times during the day. And people would come up and wishing death on themselves. And none of us thought that was the right message. And what I decided to do was find somebody who had had a near-death experience, and the near-death experience was rough on them. Near-death experiences are rough because you're close to death, right? And so I started looking for the best near-death experience I could find. And I was asked a lot of researchers, who's the best one you found? Raymond had two. Raymond gave me a guy named Andy Lakey, who was struck by, no, he was a worker for the utility company in Texas, I believe is where he lived. And he touched the wrong line. And it totally messed him up for a long time. He had an incredible near-death experience. He also lost an arm and a leg to this accident.
Wow.
And then I was visiting Raymond when he lived in Alabama. I was visiting him, and he said, you should talk to Daniel Brinkley.
Hmm.
He's the best near-death experience I've ever encountered. And it was probably, I'd never met Daniel. And about 10 minutes later, he comes blasting in the door to Raymond's house. And at the time he was a genuine hillbilly. And he came in, he had oil all over him, he'd been working on his car, and he wanted to stop by and see Raymond. And uh, I thought he wasn't the right one, but then he started talking about his experience. His experience was amazing as well. I don't know if anyone's read the book Saved by the Light, but it was turned into a movie as well. but he was struck by lightning in September of 1975. He lives in Aiken, South Carolina, which has the highest amount of lightning strikes I've ever seen. I'll tell you a story in a minute, but he was struck by lightning. He had been a military, uh, he called it assassin. He had been a military sniper, and he was a hard guy. And then he had this lightning strike, this near-death experience that took him to the halls of knowledge. He was downloaded with all kinds of information. Uh, he had a really profound out-of-body experience, visited a lot of dead relatives, which is interesting too. We always refer to dead relatives because they are people they see during out-of-body experiences. The relatives they see are always dead. I can't think of any actually examples of people who were alive that they saw. And he also was given 12 prophecies. And he wrote all these prophecies down after after he was recovered. He was in the hospital for quite a while. He had a lot of heart damage as a result. And he had 12 prophecies. I don't have the book here, but I advise that you take a look at his. You can even find them online. And he he wrote them all up, and we put them in the book, even though some seemed unlikely. One was that within a relatively short period of time, there was supposed to be the Chinese were going to sell submarines to the Iranians, which I thought was an amazingly weird prophecy. And the publisher wanted to take it out because she said it had kind of a time stamp on it. So it would take, not too many more months after that this would happen. That they would sell submarines to the Iranians, and they did. Now the publishers wanted to take it out because they didn't think it was going to happen, but it did. And then he just started to do amazing psychic things. Uh, he would tell you what you're thinking. He would tell you what's coming up at the next turn in the road, on and on. I mean, when we sold the paperback rights to the book, we were talking on the phone to the editors, and each one of the editors, he would describe their offices, describe what was where on the desk, and he would say, "There's a person outside your door. Turn right, go down 2 hallways, and turn left, and it's a guy with black hair. He smokes a lot, and he doesn't like you." And and they would say, "Oh my God, you're right." I mean, he was consistently right with all of these people when it came to his psychic predictions. So that was an interesting one for me. I'm still not sure that I totally believe in all this stuff, even though I've seen it happen with him and even with Raj, but it is quite amazing. Uh, After this, Raymond Raymond wanted to do a book. Well, he created something called the Psychomantium. Is anyone familiar with that?
Mhm.
Have you been to it?
Yeah.
No,
No?
I
Well,
just learned it from your book, your most recent book with him.
oh, okay. Well, he's a student of antiquity. He's a student of the ancient Greeks. And the Greeks, as well as Egyptians and other people, would use big pools of water. And on the water, they would pour like so much olive oil on top. And these are, with the Greeks, they're called oracles. Right? Everyone's familiar with oracles, I'm sure. These are caves where people would go and stay in the cave for a long period of time. And then they would go into a giant hall that had been created. And on there would be a fire going, the water would be boiling, and the person would be able to, they would shut the fire down and it would calm. And then the person who had been waiting for a few weeks came in and they wanted to see a dead relative. And they would gaze into that. And there's reports from antiquity of people who would see relatives come out of the water. They would be able to talk to their late mothers or their wives or whoever they wanted to talk to who had passed away. This and it was called the psychomantium by then. But other people have used it down through history. There was a brilliant person named John Dee in England, and he was the official scryer for Queen Elizabeth I. And by this time they had taken over the Aztecs, of course, and they brought back these onyx mirrors, and he would have Queen Elizabeth gaze into this onyx mirror to see the future. And at one point, she saw the Spanish Armada going down. That was one of his peak experiences. So Raymond continued to study this and decided to create his own psychomantium at his place in Alabama. And he had a procedure to follow. It involved, a relaxation procedure. I mean, you know about it, so. But and then he would have people go into a room, and on the room was a mirror, and the mirror was slightly tilted up. So when you sat down on the ground, you sat down in a low chair. Behind you, you would just see a clear depth. It was lighted by like a 20-watt law bulb or even less, and there might be a candle in there. And behind you, all you would see is this clear depth. Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, came and did it one time, and he said the view you get by doing that is the same view you get in space. It's just a clear depth to eternity. And people came in. He first tested it on students at a Carrollton college in Georgia, and he didn't expect much. He expected them not to have many experiences, but in fact, many of them he tested like 20 or 30. A good 20 to 30% of those saw their parents. They saw dead relatives. And then he got better with it, and he started bringing in other people. And they started to have experiences where people would seem to leave the mirror. And he had Joan Rivers come in, and Joan Rivers went through it, and she saw her husband who had committed suicide. She said he came out and sat with her, and then she told Raymond a number of things that he can't repeat. And on, the better he got with it, the more interesting cases came out of it. One woman saw her son who had AIDS, and she didn't see him in the psychomantium. This is a weird thing. She didn't see him in the psychomantium, but when she went back to the hotel that night, he came into the room, and she spoke to him for quite some time. She says that he then hugged her and picked her up and set her down. And there have been several cases like that. We consider it to be proof of life after death, a proof of consciousness leaving the body, because of something that happened in the last couple of years. That was a woman who came from Argentina, a very wealthy woman. She wanted to see her daughter, who had died 90 days earlier at Duke University of cancer. And she came in from Argentina with her sister. And she went to Raymond's, and immediately, instead of going through the procedure to prepare you for this, she immediately wanted to go into the psychomantium. So Raymond argued with her for a while, but people who own airplanes rule the roost. So anyway, she went into the psychomantium unprepared and saw nothing. Yet that afternoon, this is 3:30 in the afternoon, she went back to the hotel with her sister, and they were talking about what had happened and how she wanted to try it again the next day. And all of a sudden, these orbs came into the room. They were about the size of beach balls, clearly visible, 3 of them. and they moved around the room. Her sister took photos. We have 3 different photos of them. I could send it to you. Oh, well, anyway. And they moved around the room, and she fixated on one of them and felt that her daughter was in there, and she had a long conversation with her daughter. And that's kind of where Raymond has left it now. It takes a lot of energy out of him to do psychomantium, so he's handing it off to other people. It's now become medically tested, and it's a certified treatment for grief and depression by the School of Transpersonal Psychology in San Diego. And it's being used, and they're doing really fantastic research on it.
Okay, so with all the exposure you've had to all these people you've talked to and all the books you've written and all that kind of thing, have you personally had any kind of mystical experiences?
I have. I mean, I did do the psychomantium, and I saw my father.
Huh.
My father had died several months earlier, but I saw him here's how it was. I looked into the mirror, and after about an hour, my father materialized at the end of a pier. He had no interest in the ocean. At the end of a pier, totally dark background, and he was. It looked almost like he was made of aluminum. And I spoke to him for a couple minutes. It's funny, when people go into the psychomantium, you would think they would, say something that was philosophical, and all I said was, "How's it going?" And his response was, "It's great. I'm doing fine." And then he disappeared. That was a short one. There's a lot of people who go in and spend, get minutes with their dead relatives. And then I had another incident not long ago. It was a shared death experience. Well, it was a while ago. It was when my mother died, and my mother had Alzheimer's. And the morning of her death, I got a phone call from Dr. Vernon Neppy, who was the head of neuropharmacology at University of Washington. And I had worked on a project with Vernon about 5 years earlier, and I had had no contact with him at all since then. But he called me and he said, I was reading the paper this morning, and a voice said, "Call Paul Perry." And I ignored it. So he said, I got back to the sports section, and this voice said, "Call Paul Perry." So I'm calling you, and I don't know why, but I'm doing it because this voice told me. And so I said, well, that's kind of weird. But I said, Vernon, like, he was the perfect specialty to handle someone like my mother, because he was a neuropharmacologist. And I told him what was going on, that my mother was dying, and she had Alzheimer's. Do you have any suggestions? And he suggested a few things. He even suggested electroshock therapy. He said they had tried that on an elderly woman within the last month or so of this conversation, and that it kind of rebooted her. So he was looking into that as a treatment. I don't hear anything coming out of that at all, so I guess he didn't do it as a treatment. But in the course of having this conversation, my phone is beeping that someone's trying to call me. So I said, "Vernon, I'll call you back later, okay?" And I answered it, and it was my mother had just died at the care facility.
Hmm.
So that is an example of a shared death experience.
Yeah, the other thing is that in one of your books, Raymond talks about how he had a near-death experience, or was getting into a near-death experience a couple of times.
He did.
But
Yeah.
I never really hear him talk about that in any of his podcasts or anything.
Yeah, he does talk about a little bit. We just did a masterclass series for a company called Humanities Team. We just finished that this week. And he'll mention something about that. And I have a lot of video of him talking about his own near-death experience.
Oh, okay.
But he didn't feel like it was that extensive.
Right. Yeah, from what I recall, from what I read, he said that he sort of got into the, I guess, the waiting room or something.
No, he got close to the city lights, as he put
Right.
it.
Something like
So, so
What's the acceptance been like in the medical community with near-death experience stories?
well, it's interesting you bring that up because early on it wasn't good at all. I mean, a personal example, early on would be like 35 years ago. And I was writing a book at the time that I was writing Closer to the Light, this book about children and near-death experiences. I was also writing a book on reversing heart disease. And I was working with the Dr. Herman Hellerstein at Case Western in Cleveland. And I went to see him, and we were having a conversation out by a nurse's station. And he said, "What are you doing besides writing this book, the book on reversing heart disease?" I said, "I'm doing a book on near-death experiences." And he says, "That's all bullshit." He said, I have brought, he said, he overstated himself. He said, I've brought back 1,000 patients, but which I don't think is true. That's a lot. But he said, I've brought back 1,000 patients, and I've never, ever heard any of them talk about a near-death experience. And then he went off, he got a call, he went off down the hall, and the nurses came over. And the nurses said, "Well, we've all heard it. We know all about near-death experiences. We've all heard it. And Dr. Hellerstein doesn't know about it because he doesn't talk to his patients."
Hmm.
And I think to an extent that was true at that time, but I also think the patients didn't talk to him about anything that had happened to them because it was kind of a taboo subject. It's all changed now. If you look at the new book that we have, Proof of Life After Life, it's full of stories from doctors. And I don't know what the change was other than they started to hear more and more about them from their patients. But yeah, it's changed a lot. And now there's a lot more. I mean, I'll talk to doctors once a month at least who have stories to tell.
Are you finding any differences between neurologists and brain surgeons as far as their belief and the stories that they may bring back?
Well, that's interesting too. There's a great case that involved at Barrows Neurological Institute. He was actually voted, if doctors do this sort of thing, as the best brain surgeon in the world. Spetzler, Dr. Spetzler. And he had a case where they had a woman he was really specialized in aneurysms. They had a woman who had an aneurysm that was starting, I guess I guess it hadn't started yet, but it was close to it. So they did this type of surgery that's called they freeze them down, and they cooled her down, her whole body, until they finally stopped the heart,
They
and there's no.
they cooled her down and they took all the blood out of her brain.
They took
and
all the
everything.
blood out of her, and then they went ahead and they took care of the aneurysm. But when she came back, she described everything that happened in the operating room while she was having surgery. Even though when they do surgery, they really close up their ears so they can't hear it, and they also put earphones on them so they can really not hear it. And she described tools. She described what Spetzler and other people were saying. And Spetzler has written about this before because it's such a unique case and it's been very well researched. He allowed it to be researched. So I think a lot of it has to do with if it's like when you have a near-death experience, you totally believe in him. And I think that was with him. It was an experience that he had that he didn't expect to have happen. So I think they're starting to loosen up about near-death experiences, even brain surgeons and neurologists.
Yeah, well, one thing we might want to consider is the fact that despite what you may have been told, there's no known way that the brain can think at all.
That's
all you have in the brain is electrical impulses going off, and there's no way to get thought or anything else out of electrical impulses.
Yep.
And there's a guy named Donald Hoffman, who's a cognitive neuroscientist and heavily into physics, math, the whole 9 yards. And he even goes so far as to say that your brain does not exist until you look for it. When you
interesting.
look for it, it'll be there. When you're not looking for it, it's not there. Because everything is a virtual reality. Consciousness is generating the virtual reality, and consciousness only generates what it needs to generate for the particular situation that you're in.
So what does that make you think about thoughts? Where do thoughts
That
come from?
means thoughts and consciousness create time, space, and the universe. So thoughts and consciousness are fundamental, and everything else is generated from thoughts and consciousness. So the whole world and everything you know is actually generated by consciousness. And it's like a virtual reality. Right now you got a virtual reality headset on, and you think you're in this world. And when you die, you just take that headset off, and then you find out what you really are.
Well, that's what Max Planck said, essentially.
Right.
Yeah, a lot of these guys really got into it. John Eccles and
Yeah,
people.
well, if you haven't listened to Donald Hoffman, you really need to look him up, because he's a hard-nosed scientist, and he goes at it with the math. Okay, he just doesn't wave his hands. He's got the math, and he has shown that physicists, high-energy physicists, have shown that time and space don't have any meaning beyond certain limits. And so it's not fundamental, and everything, and his idea is that everything, consciousness is fundamental, and it generates everything.
So what is that? That's what Planck said too, that everything's created by, he said everything's created by consciousness, and there's a lot of love in that too. Interesting enough that he would say that.
Part of that is quantum physics too, though,
Right.
because that goes hand in hand with everything exists as a wave of potentiality until it's observed.
Right.
So part of that is my brain doesn't exist until I observe it. I mean, that's a reach maybe, but everything you're saying does go hand in hand with quantum.
So, yeah, well, basically, quantum physics is actually derived from consciousness too. So quantum physics is not fundamental. It's something that comes from consciousness. And,
so you're saying
consciousness is more basic than anything else.
Well, somebody even goes so far as to say rocks have consciousness.
Well,
actually,
Evan Alexander, I think, is on the same wavelength what you all are saying. When book The Mindful Universe, that's consciousness is creating all this.
Right, and I think it's more a question of not what is conscious, but what does consciousness use as an avatar. In other words, consciousness is using your body as an avatar right now. Now, could consciousness use a rock as an avatar? Maybe, who knows? But Hoffman also says that there's no distinction between what's living and what's dead. Okay, your body's not alive because your body is just an avatar. Just like if you put a headset on and you have an avatar in a virtual reality, that avatar isn't alive. Okay, you're alive and you're using the avatar.
You know what, you're using the word avatar. I think the word that appeals to me more is an expression. Consciousness, I'm an expression of consciousness. Or if I think consciousness is actually love, then I'm an expression of that energy. And that is coalesced and slowed and taken on mass, taken on form, but at its essence is simply energy.
Yeah, you could put it that way too. Yeah. Anyway, that's just, well, my take on it.
So if I could turn this back to Paul.
Yeah.
You're very close with Raymond Moody, I think, still. And
oh yeah, sure. I just talked to him this morning.
Yeah, it appears he doesn't try to explain what's going on. Tell me, do you get into conversations like this with him as far as consciousness creating all this? He's careful, at least in the interviews I've seen, not to go there with this. What do you
He's
hear?
not even interested in the subject, to be
Interesting.
frank. He says that he thinks it's so indecipherable, I guess is how he puts it, that that he really doesn't get into it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
He sticks to the evidence that there is a life after life, but explaining how that's happening, he just doesn't go there from what I
No,
can
he
see.
doesn't go there at all. He doesn't he doesn't try to explain God. He doesn't try to explain what God thinks, which a lot of people expect him to.
And tell me about the last book that you did with him, where you actually took 7 areas, 7 examples of shared death experience, or why there seems to be a strong case for life after life. What was that experience like working with him on that?
Well, over the years, you know, we've done a lot of books together and we've spent a lot of time together. And we do talk a lot about, over the years, we've always had shared death experiences to draw from. You know, a shared death experience is when someone who is well experiences the transition of somebody who is dying and the elements of their transition. If they leave their well, that's if they leave their body, they might leave their body with them. But there's other ways to define it as well. But a shared death experience is when someone's death experience is shared, comprehended by someone who's well. And we've had those a lot over the years. We've had a lot of shared death experiences. And from the very beginning with The Light Beyond. And all of a sudden, over the years, it was just about like 4 or 5 years ago, we both realized we had shared death experiences. He had one at the deathbed of his mother, and he had his entire family there. I think there were 7 of them, and they all experienced something that would be considered like supernatural, mystical. She died. She saw her husband. Some of them saw their father at the same time she was seeing the same guy. And Raymond had a sense that the room had changed geometry. Others went up into a tunnel. And that's a shared death experience. That's kind of an extreme one. And mine was with the one I just recounted with Vernon Neppy. And we started to look at these differently. I mean, once you have one, you look at it differently. You look at it as a sincere possibility. And so we started to group our shared death experiences and realize that they could prove that consciousness has left the body. So, for example, we had a woman years ago who had an out-of-body experience in the middle of surgery. It was emergency surgery. Some bile duct or something had broken. And so she was in surgery. This was in Georgia. And her kids they didn't come to see her. She was in surgery. They were in the waiting room. Her husband was in the waiting room. Her brother-in-law had just arrived in the waiting room. He was dressed for golf, to play golf. And she left her body and went out into the waiting room and could see that her daughters were dressed in mismatched plaid, and that her brother-in-law was on the phone with a friend, and he was saying, "I don't think I'll make our golf date today. Eva is about to kick the bucket." And so when everything was over and they came into her when she woke up, that's what she says. Says, "You guys were dressed in you had each other's skirts on. You were mismatched plaids." And she told her brother-in-law, "Next time, just go play golf. I was happy where I was. Just go play golf." And she recounted a number of things that happened in the operating room that were confirmable. So a shared death experience in that case is a confirmable mystical experience. And so we started looking at shared death experiences and realizing, well, these are proof of some kind of consciousness leaving the body. So we then decided to, we decided to see how we could make them most palatable with the public, because there's 7,000 proofs probably of a life after life. But we broke them down into these 7 different groups: precognition, out-of-body experiences, experiences of light, mist, and music, which are kind of fascinating. A lot of doctors down through the ages and even currently have seen mist, and doctors and nurses, healthcare workers, family members have seen a mist leave a person's body as they die. And we've had now several doctors tell us about seeing these. One described it vividly as kind of a greenish mist that rose out of this woman, and then he had a nurse with him, and she saw the same thing. And then he said it was like sucked up into a vacuum tube and was gone. That's a common explanation of it. So we decided that's one of the elements that we used in the 7 proofs. And transformation, people being transformed, is something that everybody can see. So that, to a large extent, is a shared death experience. Psychomantium is a shared death experience as well, according to what we're dealing with here. And that's why we broke it up into 7, because it's more palatable to people to read it, rather than go off on some vague analysis of a number of things. And over down through history, there's been a huge number of experiences like this. People seeing mist, people having out-of-body experiences. You find them with Aristotle and Socrates and on and on. So these have been around.
Well, I remember you shared an experience yourself in that book about, I forget the name of the deathbed visions. You had somebody across the hall in the hospital, the uncle.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There's also a thing called terminal lucidity.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's one of the 7 proofs. It's when people who are at terminal, when they're ready to die, and it's generally with something like Alzheimer's, dementia, but it's also brain trauma as well. They will seem to fade away and then they'll come back, or they're close to fading away and they come back. And that's the lucidity part of terminal lucidity. And the experience I saw, it's only been named and defined since I think 2011 or 17, something like that. But it's you see accounts of it all the way back to ancient Egypt. But the one I saw was my son had a broken femur from a motorcycle accident, and he was in the hospital, and I was staying with him the whole time he was there. And there was, across the hall, a man was brought in with end stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, and he would just lay in bed all day. And his family would come in almost daily. He had a fairly large family, and they would come in, one at a time or sometimes in a group. And then one day I came in and he was standing up on his bed, and he had his whole family around him, and he was talking to them very excitedly and talking to each one about his will, what would be left to them, talking about how he felt about them, telling family stories. It was very energetic. And finally he laid down and went to sleep. And his family said, we'll be able to take him home soon, won't we? And they said, no, they just let him stay here a couple more days. And he died before the next day. That's a case of terminal lucidity. And there's research being done on it now by the National Institutes of Health to see if they can number one, they're looking at it from a consciousness point of view. Did consciousness come back into this person's body? Because some of the cases are people who have Alzheimer's they had meningitis. There was a great woman, Catherine Emmer, in 1922, who had meningitis her entire life, and she lived in an institution. She never spoke. She fouled herself, she growled. And then one day she came out of it. One day she was found sitting up in her bed singing a song. And all the doctors and nurses from the institute came because they had been with her for her entire life. And they didn't know what was going on. They felt sort of like this might be a turnaround for her. But in fact, she died also the next day. And most people who have terminal lucidity die within a couple of hours or within a couple of days. But hers was so extraordinary that it led her doctor, Dr. Wittenben, who was in the National Socialist Party in Germany. He stood up for mentally ill patients and patients with neurological difficulties. He stood up for them by saying that they shouldn't be eradicated the way Hitler wanted to do, but that it should be realized that they have somewhere hidden in there, they have a personhood, and that personhood needs to be respected. And so at this particular time, they decided not to eliminate people with these problems. I don't know what they did eventually.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. Yeah, terminal lucidity is very interesting. But that's why we adopted those 7, because we had a lot of case studies. We had a lot of case studies with precognition, where people would wake up in the middle of the night, they would see a friend at the end of the bed, and the friend would tell them that they were going to die, or they had a psychic connection that told them the person was going to die. And then they would report it, it was verifiable. And the person would die, sometimes at great distances. There's a book called Phantasms of the Living. It was assembled in the 19th century by 3 doctors. I think one was an engineer and a psychiatrist. They didn't have psychiatrists in, but it was like 2 or 3 doctors and 1 engineer. And they put together hundreds of case studies of near-death experiences, of other types of mystical experiences. And precognition plays a big role in that book because there were so many precognitive experiences. But what was neat about it in the 19th century was that there was no easy way to communicate. So one of the case studies was a man who died in China. He worked for the British, and he died in China unexpectedly. And both sisters had received a letter from him saying that he wasn't feeling well and blah, blah, blah. And they both received that at the same time in different parts of the world. One of the sisters was in Western China, and the other sister that received the letter was in England. So you have that, those are like really confirmable precognitive experiences.
Question for you. Brinkley is the only NDE you wrote a book about other than Party. Is that
Rajiv Party? He's a medical doctor. He was the head of anesthesiology at Bakersfield Heart Hospital.
How did you come to write his story? What was that experience like?
Yeah, it's funny.
Very good NDE.
It's a great one. I read about it. I don't remember where, but I read about it, or maybe he was on Coast to Coast or something. And I looked him up and said I wanted to write the book because it had so many very unique elements in it. I mean, he had prostate cancer, and then as a result of that, he kept having infections. And he got an infection one time that spread throughout his abdomen. It was on Christmas Eve. And his wife, in a panic, drove him all the way to Los Angeles to go to UCLA. And he had surgery. They had to swab him out. He was full of infection. And he saw what the doctor was doing and heard jokes that the doctor was telling and was able to recount them later for the doctor. But while he was in a near-death state, he had a very profound near-death experience in that he saw his father. His father and he had never gotten along because he was at an early age was kind of a goof off, and his father was Indian, lived in India, and wanted to make sure that he became a medical doctor because that's what he had wanted to become. So he forced Raj to go to school and was quite brutal with him. And so he relived that, but then was able to talk to his father from a different point of view, from his father's point of view, that he wanted him to excel in his life. And maybe he didn't do the right things with him, but you're a doctor now, is essentially what he said.
Hmm.
He went over what he said was hell. And he said he could smell flesh burning, and he passed over that into a void, which he then described as a tunnel. And the tunnel was full of his departed family members. And even to the point that he saw people in the tunnel that were family members that he had never met, and saw and recognized them later from old family photos. We have several of those in near-death studies. And he went up and he encountered a field of light, a being of light, but he couldn't tell what it was. He couldn't tell who it was. And the being of light counseled him about his life. And Raj had addictions. He had addiction to pain pills, and they were easy for him to get. He was kind of he loved stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
He would buy cars, and his house was so big that they would have to communicate with each other by cell phone, from one end to the next. I mean, one time he came home and he heard noise in the back of the house, and he went back there and it was full of construction workers, and they were building, outfitting a building or building something else, another room. And he said, "What are you doing? I don't know who you are." And he said, "Well, we've been here for over a week building this room. You didn't notice us?" So, I mean, he was very wealthy and wanted everyone to know it. But that all changed after his encounter with the being of light. The being of light was counseled him, as it does to many people, and it was turned him into more of an empathic person. But to go a step further, the being of light also gave him two angels. Both of them were Christian angels. One was Michael, and the other was I can't remember the other one's name, which kind of jokingly infuriated his wife when he told her, because he said, "We're Hindu." She said, "We're Hindu. We have 50,000 angels and gods you could find. And why do you have to choose a Christian one?" So they told him the being of light, as well as these angels, told him to quit anesthesiology and quit being the head of anesthesiology and start practicing something called consciousness-based medicine. And he said, "Well, what is that?" And they said, "Well, you have to figure it out. We're not going to tell you." And when he came back, he can, to this day, says he can conjure them through meditation. And they counsel him if he wants on a very regular basis. He still hasn't fully figured out consciousness-based medicine, but he feels like, because his consciousness he was such an addict, that his consciousness told him that he should practice addiction medicine. So that's how he's interpreted consciousness-based healing. They sold their house in Bakersfield. He sold all of his cars. He had a Hummer and a Mercedes and a big Lexus. And he and his wife moved to Santa Cruz, to Aptos. And he's starting a practice there of consciousness-based healing. It's a fascinating guy to be around. The book is Dying to Wake Up. And it's a terrific book. I wasn't even going to talk about it today, but the story's quite incredible.
That's great.
I'm wondering how all these experiences have changed you. What's it meant to you to hear these stories, and how do you think you've changed over the years?
I think it's changed me a lot. I mean, I'm far more empathic. I take a step before I say the wrong thing. I try to. And I am very relaxed about death. that's the extent for me. I'm okay with death. And I wasn't before. I mean, I used to have a fear of death until I met Raymond and I got into this whole process of writing all these books. And now I really don't have a fear of death. I have an acceptance of it. And that's pretty standard. If you look at how, if in fact, if the transformation book, Transformed by the Light, we go into the transformation study. And what we did was we looked at a lot of people who had NDEs when they were young, and then they're now, 40, 50, 60, 70. And we looked at them and how it had affected them down through their lives. And it's in the same way. They stayed empathic. If they were young, they kind of acquired that through their NDE. But if they're older when they have their NDE, they become more empathic, more understanding, less fear of death. And they read a lot. A lot of them read a lot. So there you go with that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
Sure.
This is Julie. Yeah. I'd really love to hear about more about children. And I was just wondering, with those, not just children, but with people who, well, I'm thinking about children, because if they come back and they tell their parents and their parents are not open-minded, and they sort of squelch, oh no, that didn't happen, don't talk about it, that kind of,
Yeah.
does that also squelch their kind of psychic abilities from, how a lot of them will come back and be more
Right.
psychic? Does that squelch that because they weren't supported or encouraged? Do you know?
Not as far as we can tell.
Okay.
They are very unhappy that their parents made them not talk about their experiences.
Yeah.
That was not something they appreciated, but they've made up for it. And psychically speaking, I think they're still as psychic as they were when they first had their NDE.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else?
Yeah, any other questions? I guess I got one. You may mention this already. Are you planning to continue to do near-death experience related books, or you think you may be finished with that? You're working on an Egyptian documentary. Is it related to
Right.
this?
Yeah, I've done a couple of documentaries in Egypt. One was I was in Egypt in the 90s, and I was doing a documentary film on stone temples of the Nile. That's not denial, that's Nile. And so we were going down the Nile from Abu Simbel, and I saw these three guys on camels with white garments on, and I flashed to three wise men for some reason. And then I started thinking, well, Jesus was here in the Bible, but it doesn't say what he did. There's only like 2 or 3 verses in Matthew that says he went to Egypt to escape Herod. He and his family, the Holy Family did. And and then the next thing you hear from him, he's 12, and the next thing you hear from him, he's 33, I think. And so I wonder, well, with all those years in Egypt, because he spent a long time there, what happened? What transpired? Was he involved in Egyptian magic? Had he learned a lot from Egyptian priests and wise men? And so I started to study that. And I went through all these apocryphal books that told us stories of Jesus that aren't in the Bible. And there's many of those. And there's the Quran. The Quran has more stories about Jesus, Mary, and Joseph than the Bible does, far more.
Huh.
And so I pulled all those together, and I went and talked to the Pope of Egypt. At the time was Pope Shenouda. He's the Pope of Coptic Christians. And I talked to him about what I wanted to do. I wanted to follow a trail from Israel to where they turned around, which is I found later an area called Asut, which is in the center of Egypt. And the Bible says he journeyed into the center of Egypt and destroyed a number of temples on the way. Okay. So the Pope gave me a map that they believe the Holy Family followed, and with different sites that they followed along the way, that they visited along the way, and that there's stories that are tied to these sites. So I mapped it all out, and I decided to go there and write a book. And I did a book called Jesus in Egypt, and where I followed the trail from Israel, from where Rafah is now. Actually, there's a place near Rafah called El Arish, which is also full of terrorists. And I went there, started there, and then went across the Sinai all the way through all these other amazing sites, through Cairo, Cairo was not there. It's only Cairo's not that old, and then down to Asut, and I did a book on it. When I got to, there's all these miracles that took place along the way, and some of the miracles are visible today, and including when I got down to Asut, for instance, it was just weeks after 9/11. I left within 8 weeks. I flew from, I live in Arizona, but I flew to New York, and I went to the World Trade Center, and it was, it was all crumbled, and there were still signs all over, people looking for missing loved ones. And then I got on the plane and went to Egypt, and it was totally different from what I expected. People were so happy to see an American, and they kept saying, bring your friends over, we're dying here, because they didn't have any tourism. And I followed this trail and recorded everything at each site and wrote a book about it. And so the day the book came out, I was being visited by a producer from History Channel, and I gave him the book. He wanted me to do something else. I've had a history of doing work with shipwrecks. I excavated the only pirate ship in the world to be excavated. I was on that team, wrote a book about it. And so he wanted me to go up and excavate a ship that sank in Nova Scotia. And I gave him a copy of the book when he went back to the hotel, and he came back, he read it that night and said, let's skip Nova Scotia and go back to Egypt and do a documentary about Jesus in Egypt. So that's what I did. And it was late in the year. It was in, I think we started shooting there in April. And by the end of the trip, it was so hot that it shut our cameras off when we got back to Asut. But Asut, to dwell on that a minute, is a vision site. It's a vision site for Coptic Christians and Muslims too, because they worship Jesus as well. And in the year 2000, there were these flashing lights that took place over Asut, and they were very, very powerful lights. No one could figure out where they came from. Tens of thousands of people came from all over Africa and from Europe as well, and some from America. There was one article, a short article written about it in the New York Times, but that's it. And this went on for a long time, and then the lights stopped. But at the Asut monastery, Coptic Christians can be priests, and they can be married, and they can be priests after they've retired. So I would start talking to these two priests who were engineers, and they decided to use the scientific method to examine these visions, these lights. And they wrote up a questionnaire, and they wanted everyone to write, what they saw, when they saw it, what it meant to them, blah, blah, blah. And part of the way through, people started coming into the church saying that they had been healed by these lights. And so these priests, being scientists, said, okay, they created a new questionnaire, and then they told people, you can fill this out and bring it in, but if you don't bring it in with your medical records, we won't accept your questionnaire. So they brought in their medical records. And then he had a group of Muslim and Christian doctors examine each case that was brought in to see if there, in fact, had been healings done. And they found a large number of them that they declared to be healings. So I was there and I was working on I was working on a project called Visions and Miracles in Egypt. And we did that. And you can find that. Where can you find that? On Amazon, I think. I know it's on Apple as well. There's streaming services. It's on, like 20 streaming services. And it's called Visions and Miracles Out of Egypt. Visions and Miracles Out of Egypt. But I want to go back now and see if these people remained healed or if it was a placebo, and then talk to more of these doctors. So I want to do a follow-up documentary on that to take a look at miracles. It's an opportunity that doesn't come up often. So I figured it has a lot of good paperwork behind it, and it would make a good documentary. And I'm curious. I mean,
Are
that's
you-
the thing. Huh?
I'm sorry, are you
Well-
a videographer?
I'm sorry, what?
Sorry,
It's okay. I got one too.
Videographer. Do
Am
you
I-
shoot
No. I'm a producer when it comes to that, script writer,
Yeah,
and that's kind of it. No, I can use a camera, but other people can use it much better than I can. So I'd prefer to use one of them. Yeah. And the odd thing about it is I'm not religious, but I keep running into these subjects that are very fascinating to me. I mean, Jesus is the most influential person in world history, arguably, but I think that's probably true. And to find out that he was in Egypt and to be able to trace the trail of Jesus through Egypt is very exciting. And that's why I wanted to do that. I thought no one had done it. And I was the first American to do it and the second American to do it. So I don't know if anyone's done it since then. It's a tough trail. And the same way with the Visions and Miracles, it was just, I was approached to do that. I was approached by a scientist from the FDA. Kerry Malik was his name. And Dr. Malik he passed away, but he was an Egyptian. And he was there in 1968 to witness this visions at Zaytun. They were Marian visions. And they have a wonderful story behind them. It's so many people saw them. And so he wanted to do a documentary about, over the years, he'd been collecting footage and things of visions and miracles in Egypt. So he hired me to do this, and I went back and did that. Those are my two from Egypt. Jesus in Egypt was funny. We showed it. We had a premiere and we showed it to President Mubarak and his wife. And we were all sitting together in this hardened opera box in the Cairo Opera House. And his wife, Boutros Ghali was there. And who else was there? Anyway, a lot of cabinet members. And his wife kept turning around and saying, "This is an Egypt I've never seen." And if you do that, if you follow the trail, like the trail of Jesus through Egypt, it is an Egypt that most people have never seen. So.
Wow. So your intellectual curiosity has just carried you on this journey, and
That's what happens. I mean, with each of these books, there's a question that comes up that I think should be answered. And then I'll go talk to I work with co-authors for a specific reason, but I'll go to them and talk to them about this idea, and then they'll buy into it or not. And the reason I like co-authors is I have immediate access to the best information. I mean, when I'm able to work with Raymond, I get immediate access. And Jeff Long and people like that. It's because we're working together, and that's why I've co-authored so many books.
So it's not so much they're looking for a pro to help them write a book, but you actually approach them because you're curious about the subject, and together you all decide it'd be a good idea.
Yes. I think every one of the books I've done, I'm looking at a list right now, with the exception of evidence of the afterlife, which I did with Jeffrey Long,
Mhm.
have been that I've approached them with an idea.
Huh.
And then like with this book, and I'm very heavily involved in this because I am on top of the research. So, I get very involved in it, in forming the idea.
Mhm.
But then, you get someone like Raymond and you think you really nailed it, and he comes along and he just adds so much, you know.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's why I do that.
So cool. Well, we all benefit from your pursuit of this. It's been great what you've done for humanity with these books.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot.
Mhm.
If anyone wants to, you have my email. If anyone wants my email address, he's got it. So,
Administrator. Yes, I do.
well, okay. I don't know why that's come up. I'm gonna have to get rid of that. If there's anyone here who knows how to operate an Apple,
So you're
my
fine with me sharing it with the group, your
yeah,
email?
that's fine. That would be great. Yeah,
Okay.
no problem. I'm gonna
Do you
hear
have
other
time
people's
for one
thoughts.
more question?
Yeah.
I'm curious about something. You talk about Jesus, but
Mhm.
in the same light, you say you're not religious, but what does that mean exactly? I mean,
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great question. How about I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual?
Mhm.
That's a common answer these days, but I think it's a legitimate answer. I
well,
don't,
but you
I think,
obviously,
go
am
ahead.
I wrong in thinking that you believe in Jesus, that there is a Jesus, or that he's risen, or
I believe in Jesus. As far as the religious approach to it, like with Southern Baptists or sometimes Catholic or anything else, I'm not too sold on it. They're too
Mhm.
dogmatic, and I don't think Jesus was really dogmatic.
Mhm.
would you say you were more of a non-denominational
Yeah,
belief
that's a better thing to
about
say.
this, or
That's a better thing to say, and that's what I should say. Because I mean, I'm so open to other religions. I find them, it's fascinating. Religions are fascinating.
Mhm.
They're institutions of control, and then they're also institutions of freedom. You know, uh, so when you start to look at what churches are, you have to decide if you buy into what they think they are.
it's kind of like the church ruins the religion, or that
It can, but I'm working on a documentary film on holy relics, and I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with Catholics and in monasteries and things like that, and I find them to be very open. There's so many different sects of Catholicism that I finally concluded that here's what they do. If someone comes up with an idea and then 10 people start to follow them, they just create a new sect.
yeah.
And they're able to keep them in the fold, because there are a lot of different I guess I call it sects of Catholicism, different orders of
Mhm.
priests and the like. So it's better. I should say non-denominational. That would be a lot better, be more accurate.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about all the different religions and them being a great way for us to learn in different incarnations, to experience whatever we've
Mhm.
chosen to experience in a certain lifetime?
Yeah, I think it's great to have them around. I mean, I think it certainly helps with learning how other different people think. I guess that's what you were talking about. Um, yeah, no, I think it's great. I think it's great to dabble in all of them, and
It's also a
not
good way to find out what we're not by to discover who we are
yeah.
by practicing what we're not, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect.
Mhm. Good stuff. Any other questions, or we'll let Paul go? This has been wonderful. Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Paul.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us.
Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thanks a lot.
Curiosity.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Right.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
hello.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Amazing grace.
Take care.
Wow. That was amazing.
Yeah, that was good.
Wow. Fantastic.
I'll send you all a link to my relics, one of the relic pieces. We're doing like a 4-part series on relics. And the first one was the Holy Grail, which is according to the Vatican, is in Valencia, Spain. And we were able to hold it and examine it and everything else. You know, that was great.
Yeah, I'll
Wonderful
share any of
job.
that with the group. I'll email it to everybody.
Yeah. Okay, I'll send it off to you.
Oh, good. Well, I hope we cross paths again. It's
Let's make
fascinating
sure
to
we
be
do.
with.
Let's make sure we do. Okay.
Great. Thank you.
So long.
Thank-
Bye-bye.
Thanks, David, for organizing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks a lot, David. I flaked out.
David.
How many times did I flake out on you, David?
No, you were good. We had some trouble with email a couple of times, but no, you were
Yeah.
wonderful.
And now I'm the administrator, so that'll be better. All right. See
All
you.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Night.